On the surface, James Carter seemed like the kind of person you wouldn't notice twice. He lived in a modest, well-kept house at the end of a quiet street. Every morning, he could be found on his front porch with a steaming cup of coffee, the same battered book in his hands. His yard was always immaculate, with rows of vibrant flowers blooming under the care of his green thumb. To most of the neighborhood, he was simply the new guy, quiet and unassuming. But for Karen Davis, his next-door neighbor, James wasn't just another resident. Karen was the self-proclaimed eyes and ears of the block. She knew everyone's routines, their visitors, and even how often they mowed their lawns. In her mind, her vigilance wasn't just nosiness, it was a civic duty. So, when James moved in, Karen made it her mission to figure out everything about him. From the moment he unloaded his boxes, she stood at her window, notebook in hand, scribbling down every detail she could observe. His lack of chatter and the steady rhythm of his quiet life unnerved her. "He's too quiet," Karen muttered to herself one evening as she peered through her blinds. James had been out in his garden again, planting a new row of hydrangeas. He worked in silence, his movements methodical, his expression calm. To anyone else, it might have seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. But to Karen, it was suspicious. What's he hiding? The truth was, James Carter didn't have much to hide. He was a reserved man who enjoyed the peace of his small home and the beauty of the outdoors. After years of working long hours in a stressful job, he'd decided to leave the city behind for a quieter life. He wasn't one to engage in idle gossip or long-winded chats. If someone greeted him, he'd respond politely, but that was the extent of his interaction. To Karen, however, this quiet demeanor only added to her growing unease. Karen wasn't used to people like James. Most of the other neighbors were chatty and open, happy to share details about their lives. Karen thrived on that openness. She loved knowing who had a new job, who was struggling with their kids, or who was going on vacation. But James? He was a blank slate. He didn't volunteer information. He didn't stop to chat. He didn't even have a social media account Karen could snoop through. To her, his silence was not peace, it was a mystery waiting to be solved. One afternoon, Karen's curiosity got the better of her. Armed with a plate of cookies, she marched over to James's house and rang the doorbell. When he opened the door, she was met with the same calm expression she'd seen from her window. "Hello there. I'm Karen, your neighbor from next door," she said, holding out the cookies with a wide smile. James looked at her, then at the cookies. "Thank you," he said simply, taking the plate. Karen waited for him to say more, but he didn't. No invitation to step inside, no questions about her own life, not even a comment on the cookies. He just nodded and closed the door. As Karen walked back to her house, she fumed. "What kind of person doesn't even try to make small talk?" she muttered under her breath. The days turned into weeks, and Karen's fascination with James grew. She noticed the little things, the way he always parked his car perfectly within the lines of his driveway, the way he took out the trash at the same time every Thursday, the way he never had visitors. To her, it was all too calculated, too precise. Then there was the matter of his late-night walks. Every evening, after the sun had set, James would leave his house and stroll through the neighborhood. He never carried a flashlight or a phone, just his hands in his pockets and his head slightly bowed. Karen would watch from her window, her mind racing with questions. Where was he going? What was he doing? And why, oh why, didn't he ever seem to speak to anyone? Karen's imagination began to spiral. She convinced herself there was more to James than met the eye. Maybe he had a criminal past. Maybe he was hiding something or someone. Her mind filled with possibilities, each more dramatic than the last. One evening, as James returned from one of his walks, Karen couldn't contain herself any longer. She stepped outside, pretending to check her mailbox. Out for a late stroll again, huh? She called out, her voice cheerful but probing. James stopped and looked at her. Just getting some fresh air, he said, his tone even. Karen pressed on. You sure do like your privacy. Not many people in this neighborhood keep to themselves like you do. James smiled faintly. I find it peaceful, he replied before continuing up his driveway. To Karen, his response wasn't an explanation, it was a deflection. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind raced with theories. She didn't know what James was up to, but she was determined to find out. Little did Karen know, her growing obsession with James would soon lead to a confrontation neither of them could have predicted. For beneath James's quiet exterior lay a life far more complex than anyone in the neighborhood could imagine. And Karen's relentless curiosity was about to set off a chain of events that would reveal more than she bargained for. As the weeks passed, Karen's curiosity about James Carter turned into a full-blown obsession. She wasn't one to let mysteries linger, and James, with his quiet nature and frustrating lack of transparency, had become her personal puzzle. She began cataloging every detail she could about his life, his gardening habits, the times he left and returned home, and even what groceries he brought back from the store. Why does one man need so much milk, she wondered aloud one day, watching him unload bags from his trunk. She noted that he didn't seem to buy much, just a few essentials here and there. No frozen dinners, no junk food, just fresh vegetables, grains, and, of course, the milk. Karen's husband, Tom, had grown tired of her fixation on James. You're making something out of nothing, he said one evening as they sat in their living room. The guy probably just likes his privacy. Not everyone wants to be in your little neighborhood club. Karen scoffed. Privacy is one thing. Suspicious behavior is another. And he's definitely suspicious. Tom rolled his eyes. Suspicious because he doesn't want to gossip with you? Come on, Karen. Let the man be. But Karen couldn't let it go. There was something about James that didn't sit right with her, and she was determined to figure out what it was. One day, she decided to enlist the help of another neighbor, Susan, who lived across the street. Susan was the type of person who always seemed to know everyone's business, and Karen figured she might have some insight into James. You know, I've been watching him too, Susan admitted when Karen brought it up over coffee. He's different, isn't he? So quiet. And I never see him talking to anyone. You'd think he'd at least say hello once in a while. Karen nodded eagerly. Exactly. He's hiding something. I just know it. The two women spent the next hour speculating about James's life. They entertained wild theories that he was a fugitive, that he was in witness protection, that he was some kind of secret agent. The more they talked, the more convinced they became that James wasn't just an ordinary man. Things came to a head one night when Karen spotted James leaving his house around midnight. It wasn't unusual for him to take late walks, but something about this particular night felt different. Karen had been lying awake in bed, her thoughts racing, when she saw him step out of his front door, a small black bag in his hand. What's he up to now, she muttered, sliding out of bed and creeping to the window. She watched as James glanced around, his movements deliberate, before walking down the street. Karen's heart raced. This was her chance to uncover the truth. Throwing on a jacket, she grabbed her phone and slipped out of the house. She kept a safe distance as she followed James, her footsteps silent against the pavement. He walked farther than usual, past the neighborhood park and into a wooded area on the edge of town. Karen's imagination ran wild. Was he meeting someone? Burying something? Her pulse quickened as she watched him disappear into the trees. For a moment, she hesitated. The woods were dark, and she hadn't thought to bring a flashlight. But her curiosity outweighed her fear, and she pressed on, carefully navigating the uneven ground. She followed the faint sound of James's footsteps, her heart pounding with anticipation. Finally, she saw him. James had stopped in a small clearing, his back to her. He crouched down, setting the black bag on the ground. Karen held her breath, her mind racing. What was he doing? James reached into the bag and pulled out a camera. Karen blinked, her confusion growing as she watched him adjust the settings. He pointed the camera at the sky and began taking pictures, his posture relaxed, his movements unhurried. Karen felt a wave of disappointment and embarrassment wash over her. Here she was, skulking through the woods like some amateur detective, only to discover that James was stargazing. She stepped back, her foot snapping a twig. James froze. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice calm but firm. Karen panicked, ducking behind a tree. She held her breath, praying he wouldn't see her. After a moment, James went back to his camera, and Karen took the opportunity to retreat. She made her way back to her house, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The incident in the woods didn't deter Karen, it only fueled her curiosity. Why would James go to such lengths to photograph the night sky? What was he looking for? She began researching astronomy, hoping to find some clue that would explain his behavior. Meanwhile, James continued his quiet life, seemingly unaware of Karen's relentless interest in him. He went about his routines with the same calm demeanor, never once showing any sign that he suspected he was being watched. But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James than met the eye. Her late-night expedition had only deepened the mystery, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. Things came to a head during a neighborhood meeting a few weeks later. The community gathered at the local recreation center to discuss upcoming events and address any concerns. Karen, of course, was in her element, chatting with everyone and keeping an ear out for gossip. When James walked in, the room fell quiet. It wasn't that anyone disliked him, most people barely knew him, but his presence had a way of commanding attention. Karen watched as he took a seat in the back, his expression neutral. As the meeting went on, Karen couldn't resist bringing up her concerns. "I think we need to talk about security in the neighborhood," she said, standing up. "There have been some unusual activities lately. People walking around late at night, things that don't add up. We need to be vigilant." James's gaze flicked toward her, but he said nothing. The room buzzed with murmurs as Karen continued. "I'm just saying, we don't always know who's living among us. We should be cautious." It was a subtle jab, but Karen was sure James understood what she meant. She glanced at him, hoping for a reaction, but his expression remained unreadable. A few days after the meeting, Karen got her wish. She was in her front yard, pruning her rose bushes, when James approached her. "Mrs. Davis," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I couldn't help but notice your comments at the meeting the other night. Are you implying that I'm some sort of threat?" Karen straightened, caught off guard. "I wasn't talking about you specifically," she said quickly. "I was just concerned about the neighborhood." James studied her for a moment, his expression calm but intense. "I see. Well, for what it's worth, I'm not a threat to anyone. I moved here for some peace and quiet, not to cause trouble." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but James turned and walked away before she could say anything. For the first time, Karen felt a pang of guilt. Was she wrong about him? Had she let her imagination get the better of her? But the mystery of James Carter wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only just beginning. Karen's unease with James Carter didn't go unnoticed. Her murmurs and offhand comments about him began to ripple through the neighborhood like a slow-moving current. At first, they were small, almost innocent observations slipped into casual conversations. "You ever notice how he's always out there, just staring at his plants?" she asked Susan one afternoon while they stood by the mailbox. "It's like he's watching something or waiting." Susan tilted her head, unsure. I mean, he's got a nice garden, doesn't he? Maybe he just likes plants. Karen shook her head, frowning. No one's that into gardening. He's up to something, mark my words. What started as harmless chatter quickly grew into something else. Karen had a knack for making small things sound significant, and soon, her musings about James became more pointed. He doesn't even say hi, she'd tell anyone who would listen. I mean, we're neighbors. What's he hiding, being so closed off? The real trouble began when Karen started making these remarks at the monthly neighborhood watch meetings. She never named James directly but always found a way to hint at him. We need to be vigilant, she said one evening, her voice rising with conviction. There are people who move into neighborhoods like ours because they think they can do whatever they want without being noticed. I'm just saying, we need to pay attention. James, who rarely attended these meetings, was blissfully unaware of Karen's comments for now. But her words were starting to plant seeds of doubt among the neighbors. It didn't help that James kept to himself, which only made Karen's insinuations seem plausible to those who were easily swayed by her persistence. The first real confrontation happened on a quiet Tuesday morning. James had taken the day off work to pick up supplies for his garden. The back of his truck was filled with bags of soil, wooden stakes, and a few pots of flowers, their bright colors adding a cheerful touch to the otherwise gray day. Karen watched him from her window, her lips pressed into a thin line. To her, this wasn't the image of a man enjoying his hobby, it was suspicious. What kind of man spent so much time on flowers? She was convinced there had to be more to it. Unable to suppress her curiosity, Karen marched outside, her phone in hand. She pretended to check her mailbox as James unloaded the truck. You sure do have a lot of plants, she called out, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. James paused, glancing at her. I like gardening, he said simply, his voice calm. Karen folded her arms, tilting her head. What are you planting this time? Tomatoes, James replied, setting a bag of soil down on the driveway. He didn't elaborate, didn't invite more questions. He simply went back to his work, his movements steady and deliberate. Karen lingered, waiting for him to slip up, to say something that might reveal a crack in his quiet facade. But James didn't. Finally, she huffed and went back inside, muttering under her breath. The incident with the gardening supplies might have ended there, but Karen couldn't let it go. Later that day, as she watched James setting up wooden stakes in his yard, her mind raced with possibilities. Was he really planting tomatoes, or was this part of some larger, hidden plan? Her suspicions finally boiled over when she saw a car pull into James's driveway that evening. A young man stepped out, carrying a box, and walked up to the house. James greeted him with a handshake and helped him carry the box inside. Karen's eyes narrowed. She didn't recognize the man, and in her mind, that was a problem. That's it, she muttered, grabbing her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed the non-emergency police line. When the operator picked up, Karen's voice was sharp, almost urgent. There's a suspicious man in my neighborhood, she said. He just moved in a few months ago, and now there's some stranger going into his house. I don't know what they're up to, but it doesn't feel right. The operator asked for more details, but Karen's answers were vague. He's just unusual. Keeps to himself. Always out in his yard, watching. I think someone should check it out. The operator assured her they'd send someone to take a look, and Karen hung up, feeling both vindicated and nervous. She watched from her window, her heart pounding, as a patrol car pulled up in front of James's house about 20 minutes later. James was surprised when he opened his door to find two officers standing on his porch. He'd been in the middle of setting up his new camera, a gift from his nephew, who had dropped it off earlier. The officers looked polite but cautious, their hands resting lightly on their belts. "Good evening," one of them said. "We got a call about some unusual activity in the area. Do you mind if we ask you a few questions?" James blinked, his brow furrowing. "Unusual activity? What kind of activity?" The officer hesitated. "Your neighbor mentioned a visitor and some, concerns about your behavior." James's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm. "That was my nephew. He brought me a new camera." "Is that a problem?" The officers glanced at each other, clearly realizing this was a non-issue. Still, they asked a few more questions, which James answered patiently. Finally, they apologized for the inconvenience and left. As the patrol car drove away, James stood on his porch for a moment, his expression unreadable. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but he had a sinking feeling he knew exactly who had made that call. The next day, James went about his usual routine, as if nothing had happened. He didn't knock on Karen's door to confront her, didn't bring it up at the next neighborhood meeting. Instead, he poured his energy into his garden, planting his tomatoes and tending to his flowers with a quiet determination. But Karen wasn't done. The visit from the police only fueled her suspicions. To her, the fact that James had handled the situation so calmly was proof that he was hiding something. "He's too smooth," she told Susan. "Too careful. Normal people don't act like that." James, meanwhile, kept his distance. He wasn't one to stir up trouble, but he couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the way some of the neighbors looked at him. A few of them had started whispering when he walked by, their eyes filled with curiosity and something else. Something colder. Karen's comments at the next neighborhood watch meeting were even bolder. "I'm just saying," she began, her voice carrying across the room, "we need to be aware of who's living among us. Some people don't have our best interests at heart." Though she didn't mention James by name, everyone knew who she was talking about. A few neighbors nodded, their own doubts stirred by Karen's persistent remarks. But others were less convinced. "Come on, Karen," said a man named Bill, who lived 3 houses down from James. "The guy's harmless. He keeps his yard nice, doesn't bother anyone. What more do you want?" Karen's lips thinned. "It's not about what he's done, it's about what he might do. We can't be too careful." The meeting ended in a tense silence, with the neighborhood quietly splitting into 2 camps, those who believed Karen's warnings and those who thought she was overreacting. Karen's campaign against James didn't stop after the police visit. If anything, it became more calculated. She began dropping more hints during her conversations with other neighbors, her words dripping with feigned concern. "It's not that I don't like him," she said to Susan one morning. "I just think we deserve to know more about the people living around us. You know, for safety." Susan, always eager to entertain gossip, nodded along. "You're right. I mean, it's not like he's ever invited anyone over except for that one time with the young man. Do you think that could have been his accomplice?" Karen shrugged dramatically, her expression perfectly composed. "Who knows? But it's odd, isn't it? How little we know about him." From that moment on, Susan became Karen's unofficial ally. Together, they watched James's house like hawks, cataloging his every move, their suspicions feeding off each other. "He leaves early every morning," Susan observed one day. "And comes back late," Karen added. "Probably doing something he doesn't want us to know about." It didn't matter that James's schedule was normal, he had a full-time job at the local library, something Karen knew but conveniently ignored. What mattered was how the story felt to Karen and Susan. The more they speculated, the more they convinced themselves they were right. One rainy Saturday morning, James decided to repaint his fence. It was a mundane task, but Karen, peering through her blinds, found a way to turn it into something sinister. "Why is he doing that now?" she whispered to herself, her brow furrowed. "What's he trying to hide?" By mid-afternoon, Karen had convinced herself that James was covering something up. The freshly painted fence wasn't just a fence, it was a barrier, a way to keep prying eyes out. Susan agreed. It's so convenient, isn't it? First, he keeps to himself. Now, he's trying to block us from seeing what he's doing in his yard. Karen nodded, her resolve hardening. We can't let this go on. Someone has to do something. That evening, Karen decided to take action. She composed an email to the neighborhood association, framing her concerns as an issue of community safety. I'm not saying he's done anything wrong, she wrote, but don't you think it's strange that he's so secretive? We need to be proactive before something happens. Her message stirred up a mix of reactions. Some neighbors dismissed her concerns, seeing them as baseless paranoia. But others, influenced by Karen's persistent whispers, began to feel uneasy. James wasn't oblivious to what was happening. He noticed the way some neighbors avoided his gaze or crossed the street when they saw him coming. He heard the faint murmurs when he walked past, felt the weight of their stares. At first, he tried to ignore it. He had always been a private person, preferring the quiet solace of his garden and the steady rhythm of his work at the library. But the growing hostility was hard to overlook. One day, as James was tending to his roses, Bill from down the street stopped by. Bill was one of the few neighbors who hadn't bought into Karen's narrative, and he wanted to make sure James knew that. Hey, James, Bill said, leaning on the fence. Just wanted to let you know, some folks around here have been talking. Saying things that don't sit right with me. James straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. I've noticed, he said quietly. Bill sighed. Look, I don't know why Karen's got it out for you, but not everyone feels the way she does. You've done nothing wrong, and it's obvious to me you're just living your life. James nodded, grateful for the support but weary of the situation. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. The conversation was brief, but it stayed with James long after Bill had walked away. It was a reminder that, while not everyone had turned against him, the damage Karen was doing was real and growing. The breaking point came a few weeks later, when Karen decided to organize a formal petition to investigate James's activities. Framing it as a neighborhood safety measure, she went door to door, armed with a clipboard and her most convincing smile. It's not about accusing anyone, she assured her neighbors. It's just about being cautious. Don't you think we have the right to know if there's something unusual going on? Some neighbors signed reluctantly, not wanting to get involved but feeling pressured by Karen's insistence. Others refused outright, citing a lack of evidence and a desire to avoid conflict. When Karen showed up at Bill's house, clipboard in hand, he didn't bother hiding his frustration. Karen, this is ridiculous, he said, folding his arms. You're targeting the man for no reason. You've got nothing on him. Karen bristled. It's not about targeting anyone. It's about protecting our community. Bill shook his head. Protecting it from what? A guy who likes to garden? You're creating a problem where there isn't one. Karen stormed off, muttering under her breath. She didn't need Bill's support, she told herself. She already had enough signatures to take her concerns to the next level. When James received an official letter from the neighborhood association, he couldn't believe what he was reading. Karen's petition had led to a formal request for him to address the community's concerns at the next meeting. For a moment, James considered ignoring it. Why should he have to defend himself against baseless accusations? But as he sat in his living room, the letter crumpled in his hands, he realized that staying silent would only give Karen more power. The night of the meeting, the recreation center buzzed with anticipation. Nearly everyone in the neighborhood had shown up, eager to see how the confrontation would play out. Karen sat near the front, her posture rigid, her expression triumphant. When James walked in, the room fell silent. He stood at the front, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension in the air. "I understand there have been some concerns about me," he began, his voice steady. "I've heard the whispers, seen the way some of you look at me. And I want to make one thing clear, I am not a threat to anyone." He went on to explain his background, his love of gardening, and his quiet lifestyle. He addressed the police visit, the late-night stargazing, and even the visitor Karen had called suspicious. "That was my nephew," James said, his gaze fixed on Karen. "He brought me a camera because he knows how much I love photography. If that's suspicious, then I don't know what isn't." The room was silent as James spoke, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. By the time he finished, it was clear that Karen's accusations had no foundation. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to shift. Those who had sided with Karen started to distance themselves, embarrassed by how easily they had been swayed. Bill and a few others made a point of stopping by James's house to apologize and show their support. As for Karen, her influence began to wane. People saw her for what she was, a woman driven by fear and prejudice, unable to see past her own biases. James, for his part, didn't dwell on the ordeal. He returned to his quiet life, tending to his garden and capturing the beauty of the night sky with his camera. But he carried the experience with him, a reminder of how quickly people could turn on one another and how important it was to stand up for yourself when they did. After the first encounter with the police, Karen expected James to act shaken or defensive. But he didn't. Instead, James continued his routines, seemingly unbothered by her watchful eyes. He still waved politely at neighbors, tended his garden with care, and took his nightly walks with the same measured pace. This irritated Karen more than she cared to admit. She had expected her call to serve as a wake-up call for the entire neighborhood, painting James as someone who needed closer scrutiny. But instead, it felt like the opposite was happening. People were starting to question her motives or worse, dismiss her as paranoid. "Why doesn't he act nervous?" she muttered to Susan over coffee one morning. "I mean, if he has nothing to hide, fine. But the way he's so calm all the time, it's strange, don't you think?" Susan hesitated. Karen's persistence was starting to wear thin, but she didn't want to admit it out loud. "Maybe he's just one of those quiet types," she offered weakly. Karen wasn't convinced. "No one is that quiet without a reason," she said firmly. "Mark my words, there's something going on with him." Karen's next attempt at uncovering James's secrets came in the form of an anonymous tip to the police. This time, she claimed she had seen suspicious packages being delivered to his house late at night. It was a flimsy story, but Karen figured it was enough to at least stir up some questions. The officers returned, knocking on James's door just as he was heading out for work. "Good morning, gentlemen," James said, his voice as even as ever. He didn't seem the least bit surprised to see them. "We've had another report of suspicious activity in the area," one officer said, glancing past James into the neatly kept interior of his home. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" "Of course," James replied. "Would you like to come in, or would you prefer to talk out here?" The officers exchanged a look. Most people, when confronted by the police, acted either defensive or overly accommodating. But James's tone was neutral, friendly, even as though he had nothing to prove. Karen watched from her window, her eyes narrowing. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see James gesturing calmly, occasionally pausing to smile or nod. At one point, one of the officers handed something back to James, his ID, perhaps, before shaking his hand. When the police left without so much as a warning, Karen felt a wave of frustration crash over her. "What does he say to them?" she hissed under her breath. "Why do they keep letting him off so easily?" Karen's irritation turned to curiosity one evening when she noticed something unusual in James's yard. She had been peeking through her blinds, as usual, when she saw him kneeling near the edge of his garden, his hands working quickly in the soil. "What's he doing now?" she muttered, reaching for her binoculars. It looked like James was burying something. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as he pressed the soil down with his hands and smoothed it over with a trowel. Karen's mind raced. Was he hiding evidence? Could it be related to the suspicious packages she had mentioned in her tip? She waited until the next day, when James left for work, to investigate. Armed with a small gardening spade, she crept into his yard, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. The spot where James had been digging was easy to find. Freshly turned soil always stood out. Karen dug carefully, expecting to uncover something incriminating. What she found, however, left her puzzled. It was a small, rusted tin box, the kind someone might use to store keepsakes. Inside were a few faded photographs, a handwritten letter, and what looked like a military medal. Karen's brow furrowed as she examined the items. They didn't seem dangerous, but they felt personal. Before she could think too much about it, Karen heard the faint creak of a gate. Her heart leapt into her throat. She quickly buried the box and scrambled back to her house, her pulse racing. As she shut the door behind her, she glanced out the window. James was back, carrying a bag of groceries. He paused briefly, his eyes scanning the yard, before heading inside. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that he knew someone had been there. Over the next few days, Karen couldn't stop thinking about the tin box. What was its significance? Why had James buried it? And more importantly, why did its contents feel like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite solve? She tried to brush it off, but her curiosity only grew stronger when she noticed other small, peculiar details about James's behavior. One night, she saw him sitting on his porch, staring up at the stars. It wasn't the first time she'd caught him stargazing, but this time, she noticed something different. He was holding a small notebook, occasionally jotting something down. What's he writing? Karen wondered aloud. The next morning, as James left for work, Karen couldn't resist sneaking onto his porch. She didn't find the notebook, but she did notice a stack of astronomy magazines neatly piled on a small table. Is he some kind of scientist? She muttered. The thought annoyed her. If James was smarter or more accomplished than she had assumed, it would make her efforts to expose him feel even more foolish. James's calm demeanor began to unnerve Karen in new ways. Whenever their paths crossed, he greeted her with the same polite smile and a friendly "Good morning, Karen." It was as if he knew she was watching him, but he didn't care. One evening, as Karen was taking out the trash, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, clutching the bin lid like a shield, only to find James standing a few feet away. "Evening," he said, his tone casual. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" Karen nodded stiffly, her grip tightening on the lid. James didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he chose not to. "I was just about to make some tea. Would you like to join me?" The question caught her off guard. It was the last thing she had expected him to say. "No, thank you," she said quickly, stepping back. James nodded, his expression unreadable. "Well, have a good night, Karen." As he walked away, Karen felt a chill run down her spine. His words had been polite, but there was something about his tone, a quiet confidence that made her feel like she was the one under scrutiny. Karen's obsession with James began to take a toll on her. She was losing sleep, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Her attempts to turn the neighborhood against him were starting to backfire, and even Susan was growing tired of her constant speculations. "Maybe you should just let it go," Susan suggested one afternoon. "I mean, what if you're wrong about him?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "I'm not wrong," she said firmly. "There's something he's not telling us. And I'm going to find out what it is." But even as she said the words, Karen felt a flicker of doubt. James, meanwhile, seemed unaffected by her efforts. If anything, he seemed more composed than ever. It wasn't until Karen overheard a conversation between James and Bill one evening that she realized how little she truly knew about him. "I heard you served overseas," Bill said, his voice carrying across the yard. "I did," James replied simply. Karen's breath caught. Was that what the metal in the tin box had been for? The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture was far from complete. James's calm demeanor, his mysterious past, the buried tin box, they all hinted at a story Karen couldn't fully grasp. For the first time, she began to wonder if she had underestimated him. But Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. There had to be more to James's story, and she was determined to uncover it even if it meant crossing lines she had never crossed before. Karen's obsession with James reached new heights. She began jotting down notes about his comings and goings, creating a timeline of his daily routine. She scoured the neighborhood social media groups, hoping to dig up any whispers about her enigmatic neighbor. But James had no online presence, no photos, no posts, nothing that could give her insight into who he really was. The absence of information only fueled her suspicions. Who doesn't have a social media account these days? She thought. In her mind, it was just another sign that James had something to hide. But Karen's resolve wasn't limited to idle speculation. One night, as the neighborhood settled into quiet slumber, she made her boldest move yet. Dressed in black and armed with a flashlight, Karen crept across the lawn to James's house. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the side window, the one she had noticed him sitting near most evenings. It was locked, of course. But Karen wasn't deterred. She circled the house until she found the basement window, slightly ajar. She hesitated, a wave of doubt washing over her. This is illegal, she thought. But the thought of walking away now, after coming so far, was unbearable. With a deep breath, she slipped through the window and into the basement. The air was cool and musty, and the faint hum of a dehumidifier filled the silence. Karen's flashlight flicked across shelves lined with books, tools, and what looked like jars of preserves. It wasn't what she had expected. She had imagined something sinister, evidence of a hidden crime or at least some clue to James's true identity. But the basement looked ordinary, almost boring. Karen's frustration grew as she searched. She was about to give up when her flashlight beam landed on a locked filing cabinet in the corner. The cabinet was old, its metal surface scratched and dented. Karen knelt in front of it, her fingers trembling as she tugged at the handle. It didn't budge. But Karen had come prepared. She pulled a small screwdriver from her pocket and began working at the lock. After what felt like an eternity, the lock gave way with a soft click. Karen opened the drawer slowly, her breath catching as she saw its contents. Inside were folders, neatly labeled in James's precise handwriting. But what caught her attention was a small, worn notebook resting on top of the files. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages. They were filled with notes, careful observations, dates, and names she didn't recognize. But one name stood out, Karen. Her blood ran cold as she realized what she was looking at. James had been watching her too. The entries were detailed, documenting her complaints to the HOA, her arguments with Susan, even the night she had dug up the tin box. Karen's hands shook as she read the last entry, "She won't stop. I'll need to act soon." Karen fled the basement, her mind racing. She barely remembered how she managed to climb back through the window and into her own house. Once inside, she locked the doors and windows, her paranoia reaching a fever pitch. What does he mean by act soon, she wondered, pacing her living room. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though James were watching her even now. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. By the next morning, Karen's fear had turned into desperation. She needed answers, but she didn't know how to get them without exposing herself. She couldn't exactly go to the police and admit she had broken into James's house. And confronting him directly was out of the question. Instead, she decided to lay low and observe. But James seemed to sense the shift in her behavior. He continued to greet her with his usual calm demeanor, but there was something different in his eyes, a hint of amusement, as though he knew exactly what she was thinking. One evening, as Karen was taking out her trash, James appeared in his driveway. He was holding a mug of tea, his silhouette framed by the warm glow of his porch light. "Karen," he called out, his tone friendly but firm. "Can we talk?" Karen froze, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her to refuse, to go back inside and lock the door. But James's steady gaze held her in place. Reluctantly, she nodded. James walked over, his footsteps measured and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space but making it clear he wasn't leaving until they had spoken. "I've noticed you've been concerned about me," he said, his tone polite but laced with meaning. Karen's throat felt dry. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. James smiled faintly, a knowing look in his eyes. "You've been watching me, Karen. And I know you've found a few things that raised questions for you. But instead of jumping to conclusions, maybe you should have just asked me." Karen's pulse quickened. What are you talking about?" James took a sip of his tea, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You've been digging where you shouldn't. And I think it's time we cleared the air." James's words left Karen reeling. She wanted to deny everything, to accuse him of paranoia, but she could see in his eyes that he knew the truth. Instead, she crossed her arms defensively. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling. "Who are you, James? Why are you here?" James took a deep breath, his expression softening. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Karen. I moved to this neighborhood for some peace and quiet. But I understand why you're suspicious. Let me explain." What followed was a story Karen hadn't expected. James revealed that he was a retired intelligence officer, a man who had spent decades working in high-stakes environments overseas. The tin box in his garden contained mementos from his service, photographs of people he had worked with, letters from friends he had lost, and the medal he had earned for an act of valor he didn't like to talk about. As for the notebook, James continued, his voice steady, "I started keeping notes because I noticed you watching me. I wasn't trying to intimidate you, Karen. I just wanted to understand why you were so determined to see me as a threat." Karen felt a wave of shame wash over her. Everything she had done, every assumption she had made, had been based on her own fears and biases. And now, standing in front of James, she realized just how wrong she had been. For the first time, Karen saw James for who he really was, not a threat, but a man who had lived a life full of complexities she couldn't begin to understand. She felt a lump form in her throat as she tried to find the words to apologize. But James wasn't angry. He looked at her with a quiet understanding, as though he had seen this kind of reaction before. "We all make mistakes, Karen," he said gently. "But what matters is what we do after we realize them." Karen nodded, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. James smiled faintly. "Apology accepted. Now, why don't we try to start over?" Karen had always been confident that she held the upper hand. Each time she made a call or confronted James with her suspicions, she believed she was protecting her neighborhood, maintaining the safety and order she thought was her responsibility. But as the tension escalated, cracks began to form in her narrative. The night of the big confrontation was no different. It started with Karen watching James from behind her curtain, her phone already in her hand. James had been unloading what looked like large, heavy boxes from his truck. To Karen, it was a clear sign something illicit was going on. She dialed 911, her voice sharp as she relayed her version of events. "There's a man moving suspicious packages into his house," she said, her tone urgent. "He looks dangerous, and we need someone here immediately." As she hung up, Karen felt a rush of vindication. This is it, she thought. This time, they'll finally see what I see. The familiar sound of sirens grew louder as two patrol cars pulled up in front of James's house. Karen stepped out onto her porch, arms crossed and chin held high. James, however, didn't appear startled or panicked. He calmly stepped onto his porch, hands visible at his sides, waiting for the officers to approach. "Good evening, officers," he said in a steady voice. Karen watched with smug satisfaction, expecting the usual line of questioning requests for ID, explanations, and perhaps even handcuffs. But what unfolded next was far from what she imagined. One of the officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke to James with a tone that Karen didn't expect. It wasn't accusatory or commanding, it was respectful. "Captain Carter," the officer said, extending a hand. "It's an honor, sir. We didn't realize this was your residence." Karen's smugness melted into confusion. From her position on the porch, she strained to hear the conversation. "Captain," she thought, her brow furrowing. "What's he talking about?" Unable to stay in the dark any longer, Karen marched across the lawn, her heels clicking against the pavement. Her face was a mask of determination, though her heart raced with unease. "Officers," she called out. "I'm the one who reported this man. I have concerns about what he's been doing in our neighborhood." The officers turned to her, their expressions unreadable. James stood silently, his calm gaze fixed on her, as though waiting to see how far she would go. Karen continued, emboldened by their attention. "I've seen him bringing in suspicious packages, and he's always lurking around. I think it's important you investigate further." One of the officers raised an eyebrow, glancing at James before turning back to Karen. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you aware of who this man is?" Karen bristled. "I don't care who he is. What matters is that he's been acting suspiciously, and it's my duty to report it." James finally spoke, his voice steady and calm. "Karen," he said, his tone almost gentle. "Why don't we clear this up once and for all?" James reached into his back pocket and pulled out a sleek leather badge holder. He flipped it open, revealing a gleaming police badge. Karen's jaw dropped. "I'm Captain James Carter," he said, his voice carrying authority and a hint of amusement. "Retired police captain, to be exact. I served for 25 years before moving here to start a community outreach program for underprivileged youth." Karen's face went pale. The officers nodded in confirmation, one of them adding, "Captain Carter has a commendable record, ma'am. He's a decorated officer and a valued member of law enforcement." James didn't stop there. He looked Karen directly in the eye, his calm demeanor unwavering. "The suspicious packages I've been unloading? They're supplies for the program, sports equipment, books, and gardening tools for the community garden I've been planning. And as for the visitors you've been so concerned about, they're volunteers helping me set it all up." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her accusations, her assumptions, all of it crumbled in the face of the truth. But James wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a second item, a folder. "You see, Karen," he said, his voice tinged with quiet resolve, "while you've been watching me, I've been watching you." Karen's eyes widened as he opened the folder, revealing a collection of papers. "Every complaint you've filed, every time you've called the police on me, I've documented it. I've also spoken to the HOA and several of our neighbors. Turns out, I'm not the only one who's had issues with your behavior." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting. Karen took a step back, her face a mix of panic and disbelief. "You've been harassing me since the day I moved in," James continued, his tone firm but controlled. Not because I've done anything wrong, but because I don't fit the image of who you think should live in this neighborhood. Karen's voice finally returned, though it was shaky. That's not true. I was just trying to protect our community. James's gaze hardened. Protect it from what? A man planting flowers in his garden? A man trying to help kids who need a second chance? Or was it just the fact that I don't look like you? The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Karen had no response. One of the officers stepped forward, his expression serious. Ma'am, false reporting is a serious offense. If you continue to make baseless complaints, there could be legal consequences. Karen's face flushed red as she stammered, I didn't mean. I didn't realize. But the damage was done. The officers turned back to James, apologizing for the inconvenience before leaving. Karen stood frozen, her humiliation complete. James took a step closer, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Karen, I'm not your enemy. But if you keep this up, you'll find out just how much I'm willing to stand up for myself. Let this be the last time. With that, he turned and walked back to his house, leaving Karen to grapple with the weight of her actions. As James disappeared into his home, Karen stood rooted in place. The gravity of what had just happened began to sink in. For the first time, she saw herself through James's eyes, not as a protector of the community, but as a woman driven by fear and prejudice. She looked around the neighborhood, noticing the quiet stares from a few neighbors who had been watching the scene unfold. Their expressions ranged from disapproval to pity, and Karen felt a wave of shame wash over her. Inside her house, she sat in silence, replaying the events of the evening in her mind. Her assumptions, her biases, her relentless pursuit of James, all of it had led to this moment. And now, she was the one being judged. The weight of what had just transpired hung thick in the air. Karen stood frozen on the sidewalk, her mind scrambling to piece together the wreckage of her accusations. She watched as the police officers drove away, their sirens fading into the distance. A sense of dread began to seep into her chest. Her entire sense of control had shattered in the span of a few minutes, and now, she was left with nothing but the bitter taste of her own prejudice. She took a hesitant step back toward her house, but her legs felt heavy, as if they were made of lead. The evening air felt colder now, biting at her skin as she turned to face the front door. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in years, Karen felt truly alone. The power she had once held, even in the smallest of ways, had evaporated before her eyes. Inside, her home seemed quieter than usual. The house she had once walked through with such certainty now felt foreign, almost like a place she no longer recognized. She stood in the entryway, the echoes of her confrontation with James still ringing in her ears. The words he had spoken to her, his calm but cutting tone, replayed over and over in her mind. You've been harassing me since the day I moved in, not because I've done anything wrong, but because I don't fit the image of who you think should live in this neighborhood. Her stomach churned as she recalled his words. It was the truth, wasn't it? She hadn't been worried about what James was actually doing, she hadn't even bothered to find out. Instead, she had judged him, allowed her assumptions to shape her perception of him, all because he didn't fit into the neat, safe world she had imagined for herself. He was different. And in her mind, that had been enough to make him a threat. Karen sank into the nearest chair, her head spinning. The shame was overwhelming, and she struggled to comprehend how she could have been so blind. How had she let herself go this far? She had always prided herself on being a pillar of the community, on being the one to protect and defend the neighborhood from anything she considered suspicious. But in doing so, she had overlooked the one thing that mattered most: who James really was. Meanwhile, inside his own home, James had already shifted his focus back to the work that had brought him here in the first place. The confrontation had been swift, almost anticlimactic in its own way. It was clear to him that Karen had been driven by fear, her actions fueled by something deeper than simple suspicion. He knew it wasn't about the gardening supplies or the people visiting his house. It had always been about her perception of him, one that he couldn't control. Still, there was no time for bitterness. James had a bigger mission. He had spent years working tirelessly in law enforcement, trying to make a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. But his heart had always longed for something else, a way to make a direct impact on the community, on the very people who had once been so overlooked and marginalized. And that's why he was here, in this quiet neighborhood, starting a community outreach program designed to reach children and young adults who had nowhere to turn. He wanted to offer them hope, a chance for a brighter future. It wasn't easy, especially in a place like this where fear and prejudice were so easily stoked. But James had always believed in the power of small actions, small changes that could ripple out and affect the world in ways that no one could predict. As he sat in his living room, surrounded by brochures and community plans, James allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't about the confrontation with Karen, not really. That moment would pass, and she would have to live with the consequences of her actions. But what mattered most to James was the community he was building, one where people could grow, learn, and feel safe. A community that didn't judge based on the color of a person's skin or the way they looked, but on who they truly were. He stood up from his desk, the papers and brochures scattered across it, and moved to the window. Through the glass, he could see Karen's house. The lights were off now, and the front yard looked eerily quiet. He wondered if she was inside, thinking about everything that had just happened. He didn't hate her, he felt sorry for her, in a way. She had let her fears control her actions, and now she would have to face the reality of what she had done. But James wasn't going to let that stop him. In fact, he had a feeling that Karen's confrontation with him might be the catalyst for change, not just in her, but in others. Maybe she would finally begin to understand the lesson he had been trying to teach, the lesson that had always been at the core of his mission, to look beyond the surface, to see people for who they truly were, not just what they appeared to be. Inside her home, Karen finally stood up, her mind racing as she replayed the events of the evening over and over. The realization was slow to come, but when it hit, it was as powerful as any storm. She had been wrong. Not just about James, but about herself, too. She had spent so much time focusing on the surface, the way people looked, the way they acted, the way they didn't fit into the neat, safe life she had created for herself. In her mind, that had made them other. But the truth was, she didn't know anything about the people she had judged. She had never taken the time to get to know them, to see them for who they really were. The silence in her house felt oppressive now. It wasn't just the quiet of the night, it was the silence of someone who had lost their way, who had made a mistake so big that it could never be undone. Karen's hands shook slightly as she took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had a lot of work to do. And it wasn't just about making amends to James. It was about changing the way she saw the world, about confronting the biases she had been living with for years. Karen didn't know if she could ever fix everything she had broken, but she was determined to try. The next few weeks brought about a series of small but significant changes for both Karen and James. For James, the community outreach program began to grow, with more and more people showing up to volunteer and support the initiative. It was clear that the neighborhood was slowly beginning to embrace the change he was trying to bring, even if they had been hesitant at first. And for Karen, the journey was just beginning. She had reached out to James, offering a simple apology, though she knew it wasn't enough. But it was a start. James accepted her apology, understanding that true change takes time. He invited her to attend one of the outreach meetings, not because he thought she owed him anything, but because he wanted her to see for herself the impact the program was having on the children and young adults who needed it most. It wasn't about forgiveness, though that would come in time. It was about moving forward. It was about creating a new beginning, one where people could be seen for who they really were, not just for the assumptions others made about them. Karen sat in the back of the room that night, watching the group interact. She didn't speak at first, but she listened, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her past actions begin to lift. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was a start, a small, quiet beginning of a new way of seeing the world. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. As the officer's car disappeared down the street, the weight of what had just transpired seemed to hang in the air. Karen stood at her door, her hands shaking ever so slightly, still unable to fully process what had happened. She had accused James, someone she had judged based on nothing more than her own assumptions, and now, the consequences of her actions were becoming painfully clear. The officers, who had earlier been so polite and professional, had left with a quiet but unmistakable air of disappointment. They had handled the situation with calm professionalism, but there had been no mistaking the subtle look of discomfort that had passed between them when they learned who James really was. James had been more than just a neighbor. He had been an off-duty police captain, someone with authority, experience, and integrity, someone who had seen the world in ways Karen couldn't begin to understand. James had been patient, and he had never raised his voice, even when Karen's accusations had flown in the air like arrows. His calm demeanor, his quiet dignity, had left an impression on the officers. They had seen people like Karen before, the ones who allowed fear and prejudice to cloud their judgment. But they had also seen people like James, the ones who didn't need to prove their worth to anyone. As the night drew on, word of the incident spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the next morning, Karen had already noticed the subtle shift in how people treated her. When she stepped out onto her porch, she found that the usual greetings from her neighbors were now stiff and uncomfortable. Conversations that had once flowed easily now felt forced. People seemed to avoid her gaze, and there were whispers behind closed doors. She couldn't hear the exact words, but she didn't need to. The looks told her everything she needed to know. It wasn't just about the cops being called. It was about how Karen had acted, how her assumptions and judgments had spiraled into an action that had embarrassed her and hurt someone else. In a tight-knit community like this one, word spread fast, and reputations were hard to rebuild. Karen, for all her years of controlling the neighborhood dynamics, now found herself isolated. She stood behind her curtains, watching the world go on around her as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Her credibility was gone. The mask of the concerned, vigilant neighbor had cracked, revealing the prejudice and fear underneath. Meanwhile, James went about his day as if nothing had happened. He returned to his garden, as calm and focused as ever, gently tending to his plants. The morning sun cast a soft glow on the yard, and James allowed himself to feel a small sense of peace. He knew that Karen's actions weren't personal. She hadn't known who he was. She had acted out of fear, driven by a deeply ingrained belief that people who didn't fit into her narrow view of the world were automatically dangerous. But as he worked, he also knew that things were shifting. There was something in the air, a subtle change. His neighbors, many of whom had watched from a distance, were beginning to take notice. They began to stop by more frequently, chatting with him as he worked in his garden or sat on his porch, enjoying the quiet of the morning. "Hey, James," Mark, the guy from 2 houses down, called out one afternoon. "I heard about what happened with Karen. I just want you to know that not everyone around here feels the same way she does." James smiled warmly, wiping his hands on his gardening gloves. "I appreciate that, Mark. But there's no need to make a big deal about it. People act out of fear sometimes. It happens." Mark looked uncertain for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "It's just, well, we know you, James. We know you're not the kind of guy Karen made you out to be. She's been quick to judge people for years, and it's about time someone stood up to her." James chuckled softly. It's not about standing up to anyone. It's just about being who I am and doing what I can to help. No need for any drama. But as the days went by, more neighbors approached, offering their support. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others shared their own stories of how Karen had once made them feel uncomfortable or unwelcome. Slowly but surely, James's quiet strength began to change the tone of the neighborhood. The truth had a way of spreading, and Karen's actions had forced people to reconsider their own biases. In the weeks that followed, more and more people began to show up at the community outreach meetings James had started. They didn't just attend, they participated. They volunteered their time, they brought their children, and they worked together to create a more open, welcoming environment for everyone. It was a far cry from the tense, divided community it had once been. James's vision was beginning to take shape, and he knew that none of it would have been possible without that confrontation with Karen. It wasn't just about calling her out. It was about showing everyone else in the neighborhood that people should be judged by their actions, not by their appearances or the assumptions others made about them. As for Karen, things weren't so easy. The isolation she had once imposed on others now settled heavily on her own shoulders. Neighbors avoided her, and her attempts to reconnect with them were met with polite but distant responses. No one seemed eager to have conversations with her anymore. When she went to the local grocery store, she couldn't help but notice how people would give her wide berths, exchanging nervous glances when they saw her. The guilt gnawed at her every time she saw someone turn away. She knew she had made a mistake, a big one. But she didn't know how to make it right. She couldn't undo the harm she had caused, not just to James but to herself as well. The very community she had once controlled, the people who had looked up to her, were now quietly judging her every move. For the first time in her life, Karen began to feel what it was like to be the outsider. She thought about James's calm demeanor, how he had never once raised his voice, never once showed anger at her accusations. He had simply been who he was, someone worthy of respect, someone who had more integrity than she had ever imagined. One evening, unable to sleep, Karen found herself standing at her front window, staring out at James's house. She watched him tending to his garden, as he always did, with patience and care. The sight made her feel small, her chest tightening with a mix of regret and shame. She had allowed herself to be consumed by fear, to judge him without ever taking the time to understand who he was or what he was doing. It was a bitter pill to swallow. But that night, for the first time in a long while, Karen found herself thinking about how she might change. How she might start seeing people for who they truly were, rather than letting her fears dictate her actions. The story of James and Karen didn't end with just one confrontation. It was the beginning of a long, difficult journey for both of them. For Karen, it was a journey toward self-reflection, humility, and growth. For James, it was the beginning of a true connection with his community, one that was built on understanding and respect. Over time, Karen began to take small steps toward rebuilding the trust she had lost. She attended one of James's community outreach meetings, sitting quietly in the back. It wasn't much, but it was a start. James noticed her, of course, but he said nothing. He simply greeted her with a nod, letting her take her own time to process everything. Slowly, people began to see Karen for more than just her past mistakes. They saw that she was trying to change, to learn, to be better. And that was enough. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where judgment was replaced with empathy, and where every neighbor, no matter their background, was given the chance to prove themselves. In the end, justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about growth. And in that quiet neighborhood, change came not with a shout, but with a quiet commitment to do better. As the days passed, life in the neighborhood slowly returned to a new normal. The conversations that had once been awkward and full of distance began to feel genuine again. People spoke to each other with open hearts, and the air seemed lighter, less tense, more connected. James's quiet strength had done what shouting never could. It had brought about change not just in Karen, but in the whole community. James didn't feel the need to speak out loud about what had happened. He didn't need to boast about the lessons he'd taught or the way he had quietly corrected a wrong. He knew that the real change wasn't in the words he had said or the confrontation with Karen, it was in the actions that followed. It was in the way his neighbors began to open up to each other, in the way they began to see beyond their assumptions, in the way they learned to listen instead of judge. James had never asked for any of this. He had only wanted to live a peaceful life, to build a community where people cared for each other, where every person had a chance to be heard. But sometimes, life throws challenges at you not to punish you, but to help you grow. It was in moments of adversity that people's true character is revealed. And what had been revealed that day wasn't just James's identity, it was the power of patience, the strength of kindness, and the deep, often quiet force of justice. Karen had learned a painful but valuable lesson, that judgments made out of fear and prejudice often have little to do with the truth. She had assumed James was a threat, and she had acted on that assumption without ever truly understanding him. But now, she could see the real story. James wasn't the problem, her own assumptions were. But more than that, the neighborhood had learned something important too. They had learned that it wasn't the loudest voices that held the most power, it was the quiet, steady ones, the ones who led with integrity, not force. James had shown them that true strength comes from within. It's not about the title you hold, the way you look, or the loudness of your voice, it's about what you do when no one's watching, and how you respond when faced with adversity. In a world that often seems to prioritize noise over substance, James's calm response had stood out. He didn't seek revenge, he didn't try to prove anything to anyone. He just lived by the values he believed in. That, in itself, was the most powerful form of resistance. Sometimes, the loudest voices are the ones that need to learn the most. And sometimes, justice doesn't need to shout, it just needs to show up with quiet strength. James knew one thing for sure: appearances can deceive, but actions always reveal the truth. And that truth is simple: never underestimate the power of kindness, and never doubt the strength of a quiet person who stands firm in their beliefs. We are all capable of changing the world, not by fighting against it, but by showing it a better way to be. In the end, it was clear, real change is born from understanding, from looking beyond the surface, and from giving others the respect they deserve. And even in the darkest moments, the truth will always find a way to shine through.